Welcome to the AI Policy Podcast, a podcast by the Wadhwani AI Center at CSIS. I'm Gregory C. Allen.
And I'm Andrew Schwartz.
Join us as we dive into the world of AI policy, where we will discuss the implications of this transformative technology and what governments around the world are doing about it. Welcome back to the AI Policy Podcast. I'm Gregory Allen. Today we've got a discussion with Professor Alondra Nelson, who is the Harold F. Linder Professor at the Institute for Advanced Study and a distinguished senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. From 2021 to 2023, she was the Deputy Assistant to President Joe Biden and also the Acting Director and Principal Deputy Director for Science and Society at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. In 2024, Dr. Nelson was appointed by President Biden to the National Science Board, the body that establishes the policies of the National Science Foundation and advises Congress and the President. Alondra Nelson, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
So we're going to have a broad conversation covering so many different aspects of AI policy. But before we do that, I want to get a little bit of a sense of you. So I'm curious, how you actually had this long career at the intersection of technology and policy. How did you get started? How did you end up at the White House and at Princeton? And also, how did you become interested in AI specifically?
Yeah, great question to begin. So I'm a sociologist of science and technology, and my work has often focused on the social implications of new and emerging technologies. I've done historical work about when communities were first trying to understand what then new genetic science meant for them. I spent 10 years sort of tracking the sort of emergence of direct-to-consumer genetics in my second book. I was a startup industry and trying to understand whether that would stick as an industry and why. And I was embarking on my third book, which was going to be a kind of bird's eye view of science and technology policy, looking at the policies of the Obama administration, in part because they had done some ambitious work around genetics. So human genetics research is kind of a thread through all of my work. And I was very interested in the fact that President Obama, late in his second term, announced the Precision Medicine Initiative, this big initiative to get the genetic data of 1 million Americans, place it in a database for scientific research. From the Human Genome Project to the Precision Medicine Initiative in the Obama administration, that sort of trajectory of research had always also been a trajectory that was about computing power. And so if you'll remember, the Human Genome Project is a collaboration between the Department of Health and Human Services and NIH and the Department of Energy, because you needed these early supercomputer power. And so part of what was happening in the Obama administration was also thinking about what do you do about data? How do you gather it? How do you process it? And so, given my research on the human genome and genetics, it was clear that very early on that genetic research was also going to be algorithmic research, right? That these were some of our very first big data sets, as we used to call them, and that the work of human genetics research was really trying to figure out what do you do with all this data? So by the time you get to things about a decade ago, like genome-wide association studies, you're dealing with these sort of vast caches of data, and the question is what to do with it. So some of the early kind of algorithmic systems were in that space. And so I had been thinking about what we used to call big data for a long time. Part of my research on the Obama administration was also looking at its white papers on big data and on, by the time you get to 2016, AI and sort of
this is the Ed Felton and Tara Lyons report. I was a measly intern in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy while Ed and Tara were working on those reports. So I remember them very well.
Okay, well you're nodding kind of vigorously. So I'm telling you your life story. I mean, so I think that's really how I come to AI, and it also means that I think about AI policy, I think it's always for me about people. So big data sets have never been abstractions to me. They've been about people and their genetic data. And so that's been one of the ways I think that I think distinctively think about AI policy.
So I think of sociology, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't claim to have a sophisticated opinion on this topic. But I think of sociology as a discipline as like we're outsiders and we're proud of it. And that is kind of our shtick, is that we're on the outside analyzing the universe. So how did you make the choice to jump actually into the policy world and ultimately become, part of the policymaking community?
I love that question. It's not only sociology. I mean, I think it is all of academia. I mean, so part of how you become successful as an academic researcher is to be iconoclastic, to say everybody else is wrong, and if everyone would just listen to my one idea. So, I would say true of sociology, but I think also true of the kind of academic enterprise in some way. I would go back to, there's this very important sociologist, Robert Merton. I spent a decade of my career in the sociology department at Columbia University. Robert Merton was on the faculty of Columbia decades before me at the sociology department. And he was, among other things, a medical sociologist. And he talked about this distinction of studying, the sociology of medicine or sociology in medicine. And I think sociology of science and technology and medicine has, I think, over the decades done a little bit of both of those things, and understood that you can't really be shouting from outside of the gates if you don't actually understand the systems, if you don't understand the science, if you don't understand the technology, if the
Well, you can. It just might not be as effective.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well,
you can always shout if you want.
To say, if your aim is to bring greater insight and understanding and effectiveness, you need to understand the sort of full system that you're talking about.
Got it. And was the 2021 White House gig, was that your first job in government, or was there some earlier part of your life?
Yes. So, I mean, I met in government a lot of young people, like I imagine when you were an intern in the Obama OSTP, who all their lives wanted to work in government. It was all, it was the kind of apex of their lives. For me, I had started so I was working on this, bird's eye view of the Obama science and technology policy world. Had started interviewing in 2016 people who had worked in that office over those 8 years, and found myself in a social network, and as a sociologist would describe it, I find myself embedded in a social network of people who were science and technology policymakers. And then when it became clear that the ticket was going to be Biden-Harris, you might recall that the campaign stood up policy committees, and I was asked by one person, several people who I had interviewed and come to know in the course of doing my research, if I would serve on the Science Policy Committee, which I came to do when I co-chaired a committee on social and behavioral science, in particular as part of that Science Policy Committee for the campaign. And then, surprise to me, I was invited to interview to be a deputy at OSTP and to reimagine the portfolio. I mean, recall that the Biden administration entered office at really the high watermark of the COVID-19 pandemic, and lots of concerns and conversations about trust and about mistrust from everything from science to government to vaccines. There was a real sense that we had to constitute this OSTP a little bit differently, that we had to have people who knew how to communicate about science. So I'm not sure during your time who was in the office, but that there was a real attempt to bring people who had expertise in science communication and about conveying to the public sort of more clearly, what the work is and was and could do. And then also to think about these social implications. And so I became the first deputy director for science and society. The directorate was, during your time, would have been called the science directorate, to sort of think about these things together.
Cool. So you walk in on day one, and I'm sure there's a lot of things you worked on.
We don't walk in on day one because we're in a pandemic,
sorry, yeah, you walk
right?
in May? Yeah.
I mean, we're sworn in.
You zoom in on day one.
We're sworn in by the president on Zoom. Yeah, there's this kind of iconic picture of the president, I think maybe in the East Room with 5 big television screens with all of these little tiles of people's faces with their right hands up. And we do the initial weeks of the transition on conference call and Skype. I mean, very few people were actually in the building because we did not yet have a national security approved version of Zoom. We didn't have an enterprise security approved. So it was Skype and conference calls.
My goodness. Okay. So you don't walk in on day one, but you start work on day one. It's your first job as a United States policymaker. I'm sure there's a lot of things that you worked on. I want to focus on the AI portion of the story. So how do you get from day one in office to what ultimately became the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, which was, one of the early big outputs from the Biden White House that you were deeply and personally involved with?
Right. So in January of 2021, I think, the first or second week, my appointment is announced in Wilmington, Delaware by the president. And in the remarks that I give there, I talk, I get 2 minutes or something to thank my family and thank my husband. And, I talk about the fact that it matters. And when we're creating algorithmic systems in those remarks, that who's at the table, how we think about how we're constituting them, how we ensure they're safe and the like. And so I came into my role at OSTP with a sort of mandate to think about, carrying the baton of some of the work, frankly, that had been done in the Obama administration around beginning to think about if we're going to land the plane and get AI right and have what we need it to do for economic opportunity, both for industry and for individuals, deal with the national security piece, and also make sure that it is safe for people, that we needed to continue to be thinking about the kind of cluster of issues around privacy, rights, data, circulation, and the like. So even before I started, I had been able to speak to that publicly. And then in constituting my team at OSTP, I spent time thinking about putting together a team of computer scientists, people who had expertise in computer science, but who were also good communicators, because it was clear, and I think also a lesson from some of the prior work, that we not only wanted to, distill what we thought were sort of best practices around AI governance broadly. We wanted to understand what the American public broadly kind of thought about it and thought we should do in the space of AI governance. And we wanted to be able to communicate clearly, going back to this communication piece that we started with, what it is we were doing and why it mattered and why people should care and the like. So a science and society team had several computer scientists on it. It had people who were legal scholars of technology, and then, as you always have in the White House, policy generalists, people who are they just know how to make the sausage and how to think about things. And so we began a process by October of 2021. So I should also say, we came into office, the staff was only about 30 people, and we really had to staff up. And there were kind of biennial congressional reports that hadn't been completed, these sorts of things. So, so day one or day two, you have people from the Hill yelling at you, being like, we've been asking OSTP for this report on X thing for 2 years now, we don't have it. So there was all of that just kind of incoming. But we were still having conversations about how we were going to think about this process and how were we going to address it. And we ended up, myself and Eric Lander, writing an op-ed in Wired, in which we sort of propose and announce, make a call to action.
And Eric Lander at the time was the director of OSTP, right?
Yes, he was, yes.
Okay, yeah. So the head of OSTP.
Yeah. And we make a call to the American public to say that, OSTP, the White House, the president cares a lot about the capabilities of AI, what the potential it might have to do both good and harm. And we want to begin engaging in a process in which we talk to all sorts of people. So obviously, the major constituencies at a place like OSTP are industry, science and technology, researchers in academia who work on science and technology. But we wanted to broaden the tent, which is why we use Wired. And the op-ed includes an email address that goes to the White House. So we had an OSTP email address. People could write to us, and they scheduled, they could schedule time. We set aside time. People working on this team from across the technology directorate at OSTP and also on my team were asked to set aside time every week to talk to the public who got in touch with us about that. So we spent about 8 or 9 months having those conversations, meeting with regular folks you would meet with at OSVP from industry and academia, but we also met with priests and with rabbis. We met with high school students. We took a page from the FDA and did a series of just listening sessions where the team just sat there and listened, and we used the FDA 2-minute timer so anyone could come and sort of speak their piece, and they got 2 minutes, and we sort of collected all that data, and we did a request for information about biometrics. So we were we just spent 10 months just sort of taking things in. And then we distilled all of this, and it was not at all a play for novelty, because I think in the space of technology and innovation, you don't want government to be novel necessarily. It was really, what can we do to ensure that these systems are safe and effective and that people can grow to have trust in them, because the systems themselves are not trustworthy, even though we apply the label to them, that we, in what instances do people need to know when AI is being used, and how should we think about that point after decisions have been made and how we get information back to people? What should be the kind of norms that we should be creating and I think expecting around that. So we have a draft document, and then it goes through interagency review and all of the lawyers and all of the redlining and the scrum.
This is the draft blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights.
Yes, the draft blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. It's a bit like a rugby scrum, like the document's there, and it's just like paper and redlining and pens and everything. And then we have a draft, and then it's released to the world October of 2022, a month before the release of ChatGPT as a public-facing product.
No kidding. Okay, so talk to us. I mean, for some folks who were like really in it, 2 years ago, they might not remember it as well as they remembered it then. And then for some folks, maybe they weren't paying attention at that time because all they could think about was ChatGPT. So what exactly was the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights? What did it do? How did it do it? And also, it's like a blueprint, right? So it's not the AI Bill of Rights. It's this document.
Right. It gets called AI Bill of Rights by default, but it was a sort of, a blueprint. How might we think about these things? So it advances sort of 5 sort of propositions, 5 principles. I've alluded to them already. AI systems should be safe and effective. There should be some modicum of data privacy, which we have yet to achieve on a federal level. There should be protections against algorithmic discrimination, particularly when AI systems are being used for consequential decisions around healthcare and resume screening and, housing access and these sorts of things. There should be notice, like you should know when an AI system is being used, particularly for a consequential decision, and that there should be some sort of fallback. So if AI is being used to reach a consequential decision about an important time in your life, that there should be somebody that you should be able to get to at some point, you don't want to be caught in the sort of AI version of a telephone tree in which you just keep pressing 0 frantically and you try to get to a human and you never do. So what is the recourse that people have? Not if you disagree with the recommendation that's the Spotify algorithm made for you, but if it's a which sometimes
you promised me I would like this song and it was terrible.
Yeah, exactly. You just press forward, and then an ad comes on and you're stuck with it. So those are the kind of 5 principles, but the document is nearly 75 pages long. And what all of that is, the rest of it, is sort of it's one thing to say, as many organizations have, there have been a few kind of interesting kind of research papers and meta-analyses that have been like, how many academic and nonprofit and industry organizations have issued some kind of AI principles, right? So we were very cognizant, like hundreds of them, a lot. Many of them say the same thing. Many of them go nowhere. So we were very cognizant of that context. And so the conversation for us as policymakers was, what do you need to do? If you want to if the proposition is that algorithmic systems, AI systems have to be safe and effective, what does that look like at a granular level? What does that look like for a policymaker? What does that look like for someone in industry? What do you do with that? And so those were the best practices that we took from industry and elsewhere around red teaming, adversarial and not, pre-deployment risk assessment and testing after deployment of tools and systems. So what were the suite of tools that we were beginning to build up as a broader AI ecosystem, as this kind of multi-sector system that could get us to a place where we said, okay, these systems are safe and effective. And so we sort of pose that question, what do you do? That's the policymaker's question. What are you going to do about it? And we pose that question about notice, about fallback if an AI system is used around privacy and discrimination issues.
Great. So, you've got these 5 principles, you've got the other 75 pages. I remember my first time reading the Blueprint for AI Bill of Rights. It's kind of got a doozy of a disclaimer page, right? There's a disclaimer that says, this is not a law, this is not an executive order, this is not explicit guidance and directions to any federal agency. So what is this document? How is it different from an executive order? How is it different from a presidential speech? How does it accomplish what it tries to accomplish?
So I think for one thing I would say that the subtitle of the document is something like making automated systems work for the American public. So it really is not addressed. Often policy documents are addressed to us, the inside the beltway wonks. And this was really addressed to the public. And it is written, and it was an attempt to sort of demystify the policy issues, some of the leading policy issues around AI.
Addressed to the public that reads 75-page reports from the White House.
But I will say this. It's very plain, it's attempted to be very plainly stated. And the document is not just a PDF, which is 4 wonks. It also is a website that we tried to the extent that you can in the brittle, Drupal #2, White House website or whatever the sort of back end of that is, make something UX friendly. We attempted to do that. And it was in the spirit, I think, of some of the Obama documents that we started with, right? Like it was raising some ideas, trying to plant a flag.
I think it's fair to say that like this is a document that relies upon the White House's and the president's power to persuade,
Correct.
Not power to compel.
Correct. Right. Yeah.
Okay.
It's a bully pulpit document. It is it's an aspirational document. So this is what our sort of AI future could look like. This is what, this is how you could feel comfortable in that AI future, if these systems had these 5 assurances around them. So it was a White House white paper, I think is probably the best way to describe it. But it also had a long tail, it's been taken up in different state legislators. So very early, within a few months of us releasing it, the Connecticut state legislature had a bill signed by Governor Lamont that basically said the state of Connecticut should look to accomplish its own AI Bill of Rights kind of based on these principles. So that's a blue state. Last year, in the Oklahoma state legislature, a Oklahoman AI Bill of Rights was put forward that includes all of the AI Bill of Rights as a bill and also has others besides. And so I think it has created in the public at its best a kind of common sense around like what should non-experts be able to sort of ask of government and companies around these systems. And I think to start with the first proposition of the AI Bill of Rights, safe and effective systems is the very least of it. We expect that from all of our consumer products, so we got to get there.
Cool. So, tell me about the disclaimer.
The disclaimer. So, so I use the word scrum. So part of the kind of interagency scrum was around, and what we say in government, who has equities in the AI space, right?
Yeah.
So I think 5 years prior to 2022 or 8 years prior during the Obama administration, that it would have been OSTP has equities and the Department of Energy and 1 or 2 other agencies. But by this time, it was very clear that AI was becoming and is going to be a very powerful, both horizontal and vertical. It's going to be a very powerful infrastructure workhorse for all of the work that we do. And it is going to have all these pillars, vertical applications that might be very particular to the work of HHS versus the Department of Education versus the Department of Justice. And so there was a lot of interest, as you might imagine, and there was concern about, as there always is, sort of what's the line here between civilian and military uses? What's the line here between civilian uses and things that the intelligence community might, want to do or need to do or think they need to do with these technologies? And so the disclaimer, effectively is trying to not only say, this is not law or policy or whatever, in a formal sense, but it is also trying to say that, there might be some non-civilian uses of AI that may not currently or ever abide these 5 proposals.
Got it. Okay, so you left OSTP in 2023, but I believe it was after the executive order came out. Is that correct?
Before. I left before.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
So talk to me about that period of time after the Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights comes out, but in the run-up to the executive order coming out.
Yeah, so, in my time, that was about, we'll use ChatGPT as a marker. I think it was November to February in my time. There was a flurry. Those of us who work in the science and technology space have been thinking and talking about AI for a very long time. Let's recall going back to where we began. The Obama administration was working on this in 2015,
yeah.
Right?
Oh, that's when the reports came out. They were working on it, well before that.
Right.
Yeah,
and so
2015.
Those of us in that sort of CTO world, CIO world, policy, science and technology policy world have been thinking about this for a long time. But when you have AI that's not just coming in the background, making, recommendations for your Spotify or your Netflix, but becomes a consumer-facing product for the first time, the expectation for, I think, politicians and policymakers is different. Like it just has, it totally reset the table, because now you had people in the general public saying, what is this? And what are we going to do about this? And is this a good thing? Am I excited? Should I be excited or should I not be excited? Right. So.
Yeah. I think one marker that we've heard here at CSIS when we've had members of Congress and the Senate on is ChatGPT was the moment they started getting asked about AI in their constituent town halls when they went back to their home districts, their home states. It really was a different political moment for AI. And that's the firestorm you were thrown into.
Absolutely. And we went from having, very close kind of partners in this work who are the, colleagues on the Hill who have been in the space of tech policy for a very long time, Senator Warner, Senator Klobuchar, Representative Yvette Clarke, Senator Booker, to exactly to your point, all legislators having to go home and say something about AI. So it also it went from being somewhat a niche issue to being one of the most important policy issues of the day. And so that meant at OSTP, we had a lot of incoming. There was a lot of questions, sort of, what are we going to do about this? Well, we had actually been fairly forward leaning. I mean, with the Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. And there was also, I think, a sense of just wanting to calm people down. The conversation about existential risk, while we always need to be thinking about the most catastrophic uses of very powerful technologies. However, there was this sort of sense that there were not a lot of people in government who, God bless them, their job every day is to be like, someone's trying to kill us. And they're trying to use AI to do it, right? There was a sense that should government be doing this AI talent surge that's part of the president's executive order? Should we have many more people working across government with technical skills broadly? Absolutely, yes. But the idea that there were not in the IC and various other places people thinking about the implications of AI for security risk was just, so you had to calm that down, I think. And you just had to sort of be able to convey to people that there were folks who had been thinking about this for a long time and who understood, if not all of the technological details of a fast-moving technology, because they're not inside the companies, knew enough and were in conversations every day and were engaging companies to make good policy around this. And there was also, I think, a challenge. The novelty hit the public, it felt so novel to the public. It felt, we were part of the AI hype cycle of 2 years ago was about sentience and kind of seamless uses of this, and that this new AI was something approaching magic. 2 years hence, we live in a world that we know is not magical in that regard. But there was a lot of anxiety. And so one needed to both be responsive, but also be able to communicate that people had and are working on these things, that there are, as the fact sheet that came out with the Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights demonstrated, agencies that already had authorities and levers to place guardrails around AI, whether that's the FTC or the Department of Education that has now released kind of best practices for how to use AI in the educational context. Like, someone's home and the lights are on, and being able to try to convey that in that very heady moment was a challenge. But I think ultimately the administration during my time and then after my time there, I think really succeeded in doing that by having I think the communication was pretty good. There was a clear set of deliverables going from the voluntary commitments, which I think was probably the next big thing after the Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, to the president's executive order, which I think does an incredibly good job of dealing with AI, both, as I said, as a kind of a horizontal and a vertical. Like, we're going to lean into using this for efficiency, to do better service for the public, to do all of the sort of core work of government better. We are going to use government procurement power to help companies partner with us as we're about to make these huge multi-million, billion-dollar investments on systems that are safe, that, deserve our trust, and that we're also going to engage agencies and doing what they can already right now, as well as looking forward to ensure that these tools are stewarded well.
Cool. So now you've left the White House. You're back at Princeton. Back at Princeton, I think it's fair to say, right? You were there before. So I want to sort of get your perspective. Now you're an outsider again, and you're looking at what's going on. So I want to get your reaction on what's going on in Congress, what's going on at the state level, what's going on internationally. So let's start with Congress. You testified at the Senate AI Insight Forum that's organized on a bipartisan basis by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and his gang of 4 bipartisan senators. So what did you make of these forums' primary output, that report, and what do you sense is happening or should happen in Congress right now?
So that moment that you described in which you had legislators going to their home districts and people coming to the town hall asking for about AI was an extraordinary opening, an extraordinary opportunity, a political opportunity to really move the needle on things that we've needed to do for a very long time, including very basic things like federal data privacy at some level. And so I think as an outsider, there was some hope that that window would allow us to get some traction and movement on some technology policy. I mean, we really have not had any sort of major technology policy since probably the Communications Decency Act in the late 1990s, right? I mean, that's probably the last time that we had sort of muscular...
This is not how you would have characterized it when you were an OSTP. So we haven't done any major policy.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's just to say that it's been a generation since we, I think, as a country, have looked at the laws that sort of structure and govern.
Yeah, a lot of it has been sort of tweaking this legal architecture that had already been built up over preceding decades. I don't think anybody's done a massive rewrite of that architecture, right? As you said, in generations.
So I had great hopes. It happened pretty soon that Majority Leader Schumer called these AI Insight forums to come to pass. And, I hope that they would move quickly with the kind of speed that the moment really demanded. And, I think for Washington and for the Senate, which of the congressional bodies is supposed to be more slow and deliberative, let's say, historically than the House, it did move at a clip. I mean, I think they did sort of 9 or 10 sessions over around 9 months and released the framework. I will say that, I felt that it was a missed opportunity on several levels. I had some misgivings about participating in a conversation that was not open to the public, right? We have the public saying, we're really concerned about AI. And, to have the response be, we're going to bring civil society, academic industry people to sort of have a conversation about this and to not even have a portion of it be public.
C-SPAN cameras, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to be, there was not a gavel, but, it doesn't have to be gavel to gavel coverage, but opening remarks or, something that gave a sort of flavor of what was happening.
They published the written opening remarks, I think, of everybody. But you're right, there was no cameras.
I mean, and then the framework itself, I think, again, there was nothing, I think, ambitious there. There was nothing that framework could have, I think, been written before you had the 9 meetings of people. I'm not sure. And there's good things in the framework, right? We need to fund the rest of the CHIPS and Science Act that's been approved, all of that R&D funding. We want to make the National AI Research Resource not just a pilot, but we want to fund it into the future. So there's good things there, but none of it required, 9 meetings of experts to accomplish, I think.
Yeah, and I think, the original ambition, I don't want to put words in the leadership's mouth, but I think they were looking at something like a comprehensive piece of legislation. And I think, tell me if you disagree, where Congress is headed now appears to be much more piece by piece, right? They're looking at deep fakes, they're looking at disinformation, they're looking at sort of a handful of other niches that they want to go after. And the sort of idea of omnibus legislation surrounding AI, I don't really hear about that much anymore.
Right. Yeah. I think that one can imagine an alternative scenario in which they had moved a little bit faster, and I think would have had a lot more political will to do an omnibus. But there also is this fundamental tension. So if you think about the sort of congressional hearing that I think was Senator Blumenthal and Senator Hawley do around AI that has Gary Marcus and Sam Altman, Christina Montgomery from IBM, and another colleague whose name who I'm forgetting. There's lots to say about that first kind of AI hearing. But one of the things that was really is an interesting moment for me is when Sam Altman says, regulate us. And Gary Marcus is obviously, as Gary is, quite concerned about AI and sort of encouraging legislators to really think about regulation. Christina Montgomery from her IBM purge, if I'm recalling, was very much saying, IBM is a company that really believes in responsible uses of AI and wants to be a partner in that, et cetera, et cetera. But there was this kind of, I think, underlying tension in which that you hear when, at one point, if I'm recalling correctly, Senator Kennedy sort of says to Sam Altman, well, if we do this kind of AI regulation, something or other, are you going to come run it? I don't know if you remember that moment. It was kind of like, well, how seriously are we about this? And can we not imagine a role for government here that doesn't, effectively include industry grading its own homework on these technologies? So that was, I think, a signal well before the Insight Forums about where we are. And then I think we have this other fundamental tension, which is right now in the science and in the geopolitics, the United States is sort of leading the world in AI development and deployment. And so I think if you're a legislator, if you're a congressman or senator, congressperson or senator, you're thinking, well, if we change the status quo, do we lose the lead? And I think I think we've not had good answers. I think there are good answers. I think one can and must do both. But we've not, I think, in the political space had, I think, a robust conversation about that tension.
Yeah. So let's change gears to a place where there is omnibus AI legislation, and that is the European Union AI Act. So on August 1st, 2024, the EU AI Act entered into force. A lot of the standards that this regulation is going to mandate compliance with, some of the drafts of those are out. What did you make of the EU AI Act while you were in the White House, and what do you make of it now?
Well, we tracked it very closely, and there were also other flows like the Trade and Technology Council. There were lots of kind of ongoing conversations with colleagues in the EU about AI policy. That AI was one of the sort of pillars of the Trade and Technology Council's work. So there was ongoing conversation. So, I commend, they paused the work, and I commend them after the introduction of generative AI. And I commend them actually for pausing the work and sort of trying to see if it was fit for purpose.
What still applies, what needs to be changed.
What doesn't apply, et cetera. I mean, I think one thing that I heard in Washington was like, oh, this is why you can't legislate AI. It's always going to be behind. But I think another way of thinking about it is that the EU had a process that allowed them to pause and sort of reimagine what they were doing. I think that it remains to be seen. I mean, they're very much an implementation stage, and that's when, things that sound good on paper sort of hit the sort of cold reality of the headwind of all the stuff, that's coming. And so I think we're in a different phase, right? I mean, one phase was the act itself, and now we're actually in the phase of sort of seeing what it all means. And so I'm...
All right, but now I've got to ask you to give me a little bit more inside baseball, right? So you're having these Trade and Technology Council meetings with your European counterparts. Are you jealous? Are you gosh, I wish I was helping to draft comprehensive AI legislation? That seems so exciting. Are you cautioning them guys, you're going down the completely wrong path, somewhere in the middle? What are these conversations like?
I think we're curious, and we are, I'll speak for myself, curious, impressed by the scope and scale of it across 27 nations. I mean, that is how do you get 27 countries to agree on anything? I mean, that actually...
the sky is blue. No, it's not.
Yeah, no. So that alone, I mean, as anybody who's worked in government, you do have to sort of look at that with some appreciation. But there was also, we understood that this is, the Columbia law professor, Anu Bradford, has given us the term, the Brussels effect, which comes from earlier work on environmental law in California and political science called the California effect, right? But the sense that there can be one governance sort of structure or government structure that has a real shaping effect. And that was certainly California and remains California is now, I think, the world's fourth largest economy. So we knew that what happened in the EU AI Act pertained to us, right? It wasn't just, we couldn't look from afar and say, it didn't pertain to us. And so I think there was, in the conversations, one would certainly try to press for what would be more beneficial for the United States and how people were thinking about framing things up.
But how did you think about that? How did you think about what the United States wants what is in the U.S.'s best interests when you're having a conversation about the EU AI Act?
Right. I mean, well, one of the things, I think there's a lot of answers, but one of the things is of course that the leading companies in AI are American companies. And so part of the U.S. interest is that you want these companies to thrive. You want them to do well, and you don't want the Brussels effect to impact productivity, economic growth, competitiveness of the United States. I think that's the kind of the sort of high level. At the same time, I think what the EU model offers were ways to think about, it was it's an experiment and ways to think about how you begin to build guardrails and think about guardrails. So I think there can be lots of questions about and debates about whether it will ultimately go too far. And I think we don't know because things are in the early stages of being implemented. Obviously, Mario Draghi thinks that it's going to be a drag on European competitiveness to have the EU AI Act. But I think as a scholar, I think it's an empirical question, and we'll have to see. I take to heart and I'm quite concerned about data that suggests, like we've got the Edelman Trust Barometer from 2024, which is multinational data about trust and lack of trust in AI. And it's very high in the United States, Canada, Australia, the kind of big Western democracies. We have Pew Research data that has pretty high levels of distrust and concern, particularly around work and how, other kinds of use cases. And so I do think it is all, from my perspective, is also in the U.S. interest to figure out how you build the infrastructure that you need for trust in these systems. Because if you don't have that, they're not going to be adopted. People are not, you're not going to have the kind of enthusiastic adoption that one might want to address some of the sort of big issues that many hope that responsible uses of AI might be able to do. So I think it was a little bit of a kind of a mixed response, but with a concern that, is this effectively, how do we keep this out of the lane of just being an attack on American companies?
Yeah, fair enough. And then you've already talked about this a little bit, but I want to bring us back to the state level AI regulations. What do you see going on here? There was the California bill, of course, that got a lot of attention around AI safety topics before it was vetoed by Governor Gavin Newsom. What do you see in what's going on in the states that excites you or concerns you?
I think I'm excited about, I think the closest model, if we think about the states as laboratories for democracy, the closest model that we have for omnibus AI governance is Colorado. It's a comprehensive law. It's now in the implementation stage. I think things are happening in the scrum, and we'll have to see what happens on the other end of that. But forward-leaning, I think, strikes a great balance between guardrails and, wanting to drive innovation, have work for people, et cetera. And California, of course, has done so. SB 1047 didn't pass, which was, had a lot of language around a particular vision of AI safety. But Governor Newsom signed 18 pieces of legislation related to AI. And so California is making AI policy, new AI policy, right? we had been, California has been good. And I think that AI executive order is very good on, if you want government to pivot quickly, what can they use that they already have? What arrows do they already have in their quiver that allows them to move quickly and think about AI governance issues? So FTC has done that, CFPB, for example. But, California has really taken the lead around deepfakes, around sexual imagery, CSAM and these sorts of things. And I think we'll continue to take the lead. And I feel good about having California in that California effect before the Brussels effect space, because so much of the industry is there. And you've got legislators who are kind of comfortable with the technology more than they might be in some other states, who know the ecosystem and who have real commitments to democratic values around these technologies and, commitments to wanting to, not staunch innovation. So I'm eager to continue to watch. I think there'll be lots of new legislation in California in the new session as well. So I'll be curious to watch that.
So Vice President Kamala Harris at various times was described by the Biden administration as the AI czar. One of the point people for AI policymaking in the White House. In the course of her performing that role and you performing your role, you got the opportunity to engage with her, I'm sure, on a substantive basis. If you had been advising, a hypothetical future Harris administration, what would you have advised that administration to pursue? And then I think you can guess my next question after that. But let's go with this one first.
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, I would point people to it's important that the people know that the vice president really knows her stuff in this space. I mean, she actually, it is not for naught that she comes out of a career trajectory of being a California politician. And she has personal relationships. She has social network relationships with a lot of leading industry players. I think she kind of gets it. She is a child of the Bay Area. I say this as a Californian myself, like there's a kind of fundamental familiarity that I think would have been tremendously interesting and exciting for a future for AI policy. I would also say she gave an extraordinary speech last November at the U.S. Embassy in London about, the American strategy for AI policy that was, about kind of really striking this balance between, running fast, but like wearing a helmet and shin guards and, all the stuff that you need to sort of protect society as we're doing that. And so I think that will be a very important speech historically. And I hope that general sentiment will seep into some of the work. So I would have been excited to see in a Harris-Walz administration, the continued kind of expansion and maturity of the president's AI executive order, which, I think really hits all of the bases and not in a heavy hand, and is also encouraging the agencies and government to and sort of wise use of AI tools and systems. So I think it would have been a good steady state. I also think, there were some concerns from industry that the Biden administration had been not sufficiently industry friendly, whatever that means. And, I think President Harris would have brought, I think, a different orientation than President Biden to industry. I mean, these are fine. These are people that she knows. So I think she still would have held the line on foundational principles about how these technologies should advance, but would have opened some interesting space for new things to be happening. And I think as well, because she, in my experience, she cares quite a lot about the R&D space. I think it would have been also exciting to see her lead and helping us to think about how we use AI for different outcomes that right now are market failure. So how do you, healthcare at scale, some of the climate science issues, some of the outer space science. I mean, there's sets of issues that don't yet and may never have a kind of commercialization pathway. And I think to have a champion for that and government and for taxpayer investments and these sort of broader public goods would have been thrilling.
Yeah. So now for the incoming second Trump administration, what's like the number one thing you're looking out for in the AI policy world?
Yeah. So one thing to say is that compared to the Obama administration, there was not a lot of science policy and not, in the Trump one. But they did a pretty good job on AI. I mean, and so some of the work that we did in the Biden administration.
I think for folks who were not paying attention at the time, for folks who sort of started paying attention to AI after ChatGPT, it's easy to forget that AI policy was pretty bipartisan in Trump 1. Yeah.
Yeah.
Unclear if that will continue to be the case, but that certainly, I think, was the case historically.
Yeah. So there were 2 AI executive orders that President Biden did not rescind. In fact, we actually implemented them. So one was standing up the National AI Initiative Office at OSTP. Another was to establish the National AI Advisory Committee. So that was work that was right in creating the infrastructure that we needed in government that we carried forward. I think one of the things that's concerning is that there are a lot of, how would I say it, sort of contradictory vectors about what might be happening. And so it will be interesting to see how and whether the Trump 2 administration even wants to make some kind of comprehensive, technology policy or AI policy. So you have, with the influence of Elon Musk, someone who has been a funder and an advocate for a pretty strong program in AI safety. And so that on the one hand might suggest AI Safety Institute not only continues to stand, it is, made more muscular, it's given more resources, and maybe industry is leaned on, persuaded to offer the models early so they can be tested for before they're deployed. Right now we have, I think just Anthropic who's actually done that. On the other hand, when you have the, potential people still to be confirmed like Pam Bondi, or Kash Patel, who could imagine might sort of take all the guardrails off AI. So you've got both the sort of poles of kind of strong safety and the kind of laissez-faire, not even laissez-faire, like, potentially laissez-faire plus uses for surveillance and violations of privacy and for retribution, quote unquote, has been promised. And so I think that's concerning.
So as we move into this future, this new presidential administration, you're going to continue writing and publishing on these issues, I'm sure. So folks can find your work through Princeton and through your other roles. Dr. Nelson, thank you so much for coming on the AI Policy Podcast.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the AI Policy Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. We also love to hear from you, so reach out at aipolicypodcast@csis.org with your suggestions and feedback. Finally, don't forget to visit our website, csis.org, for our latest research reports and events. This podcast was produced by Sarah Baker, Isaac Goldston, and Sadie McCullough. See you next time.